to make note of any questions as they rise for you. At the end, we'll have some time for question and answer, and I want to have a real robust discussion around some of the issues that kinship faces in fighting in the states. So my title is SOGIECE/CP, Prevention and Survivor Support Coordinator. We need to find a shorter title. And a community-based research center. Hang in there, definitions to come. The Community-Based Research Center, or CBRC, promotes the health of people of diverse sexualities and genders through research and intervention development. Its roots are as a gay men's health organization, but it has evolved and grown a lot in the last few years, and now includes much more of the larger group. Community-based research is research led by those with lived experience. So you have the challenge of doing research that can affect you personally as you're listening to others, gathering information of their lived experience. So it can be a very challenging work. CBRC's core pillars, I'm sure. Yeah, that is, and I forgot to put it in. CBC's core pillars are community-led research, knowledge exchange, network building, and leadership development, which positions the organization as a thought leader in Canada, transforming ideas into actions that make a difference. Next slide. So before I begin, I just want to acknowledge some of the people that have been key supports to me in my work. Michael Quagg, who is CBRC's Executive Director and a survivor of conversion practices. Dr. Better? Okay. Dr. Travis Salway, Faculty of Health Sciences at Simon Fraser University, and Nicholas Chabot, founder of No Conversion Canada. And of course, the funders, Women and Gender Equality Canada, Simon Fraser University, Department of Justice Canada, and the Public Health Agency of Canada. Next slide. I want to also acknowledge the many organizations and community representatives that have supported and engaged with me in the work that I've been doing. As you can see, they include a broad intersectoral group of organizations, individuals, and community leaders from 2S LGBTIQ+ service providers, the 2S LGBTIQ+ community, health, care, and social service providers, affirming faith-based organizations and networks, Christian, Muslim, and Jewish, as well as researchers, legal experts, and academics. Next slide. I am most grateful to the survivors. Survivors of SOGIECE and/or conversion therapy practices. I'm thankful for the courage and the strength they've taken to engage in multiple research projects that CBRC has been leading over the years, and or to get involved in some of the intersectoral advisory committees, trusting us to share their learnings, without which our work with them would be not possible. It is their voice, their courage, and their wisdom that forms the vast majority of the findings and the work we will hear about. So I want to ask a quick question. No, actually, 5 minutes. Yeah, okay. Next slide. Okay, thank you. Conversion therapy practices, and we always do therapy, right? Because it's not about therapy. Conversion therapy practices, and we tend to use the term conversion practices, include a wide range of formal and structured psychological, behavioral, physical, and faith-based practices, treatments, or services that attempt to change a person's sexual orientation, heterosexual, gender identity, cisgender, gender expression to match their assigned sex at birth. You familiar with that term, assigned sex at birth? These efforts include claims that there are causes to people becoming queer, trans, or two-spirit, all based on the assumptions that being heterosexual is the only normal way to express sexuality, and that a person's gender identity matches their assigned sex at birth. There are over 120 professional organizations in Canada, the United States, and internationally who have spoken out against these practices. Next slide, yes. SOGIECE. This is the one that always confuse people. These are change efforts that fall outside the legal definition of conversion therapy. There are many, many other ways that we are pressured to change, deny, or suppress our sexual our gender identity, or gender expression. They can be subtle, blatant, pressures and messages, microaggression, call them, which can be just as harmful as conversion practices. And they're known as SOGIECE, or sexual orientation and gender identity or expression change efforts. Many US LGBTQ+ people who do not identify as a survivor of conversion practices will have experienced these types of change efforts throughout their lives. And I want to acknowledge that these terms of language are limited and do not capture the myriad ways that conversion practices and change efforts happen, how they show up in different sectors and settings and across all our identities. Now I'm going to ask a question. How many of you identify as, you don't have to answer this, by show of hands, how many of you identify as a survivor of conversion therapy practices? How many of you identify as a survivor of SOGIECE, other change efforts? Okay, wow. Next slide. Okay, I'm just going to do a quick overview of some of CBRC's research, knowledge mobilization, and education efforts around practices and other change efforts. Sex Now, that is Canada's largest and longest running survey of gay, bisexual, trans, and queer men's health, and has been run by CBRC since 2002. A question to assess lifetime exposure to sexual orientation change efforts was first asked in the 2011 and 2012 iteration of Sex Now, and again in 2019, where it found that 1 in 10 queer and trans men surveyed reported experiencing conversion therapy. This data played a critical part in the passage of Canada's federal bill to criminalize conversion therapy. The SOGIECE CT Survivor Support Project, and that's what we're going to talk about the most today. It was a project from 2021 to 2022, led by and with and for survivors. Its purpose was to assess support needs, develop an advocacy plan, and establish a stakeholder and partner network. Our health survey in 2022 is the largest multilingual community health survey dedicated to two-spirit, indigenous, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, and other sexually and gender diverse people in Canada. The Public Legal Education and Information Project was funded by the Department of Justice. It was a 2002 National Needs Assessment to understand the knowledge gaps around this. We had this federal law, but still don't think their practices are. So we identified at least 2/3 of service providers, including medical and healthcare practitioners and social service providers, need more information, and an equal part of the US LGBT community said they wanted to know more about it, because 78% of them, 85% of them want know someone who is directly impacted by this. Understanding experiences of conversion therapy practices amongst BIPOC, immigrant, newcomer, and refugee to LGBTQ+ people happened in 2022, 2023. And like the title of it says, it was to explore the nature and impact of their experiences and the types of supports that survivors accessed and desired. The summit is CBRC's annual 2-day knowledge exchange and capacity building conference on US LGBTQ+ health. Videos of presentations from past summits are all available online, including the conversion practices that we've done in the last 6-7 years. StopConversionPractices.ca. That is in recognition of the second anniversary of the federal criminal law on conversion therapy practices, which came into effect in Canada on January 7, 2022. CBRC launched a new website focused on raising awareness and understanding of these practices and federal law. The website includes information for the 2S community, as well as service providers and the broader public to increase their knowledge of these harmful practices. And there are supports and resources. There is research, including faith-based resources and faith-based research, as well as information on the federal law. Stop conversion practices have been created with gathering the information from all the previous research that we've done. It all informed the creation of this site. Primarily for practitioners, service providers of queer, trans people, and policymakers who are working to end conversion practice and support survivors. But it's also intended for survivors themselves, family and friends, or anyone wanting to deepen their understanding. The Coalition Project, which is the one we're engaged in right now, this one-year project began in April of this year. It is an intentional extension of CBRC's ongoing collaborative work to prevent and end conversion practices in Canada. The purpose is to create a broad, intersectoral, and community-led national organization, a coalition in conversion practices to expand and support 2S LGBT+ advocacy and mobilize efforts for maximum impact on Canadian legislation and policies. I'm going to skip some of that information. There is information on stopconversionpractices.ca. All this stuff that I'm sharing with you today is available through that site too. So, in my opinion, the best thing that's come out of the municipal and provincial conversion therapy bans and the federal law criminalizing conversion therapy practices is that conversion therapy is out of the closet. And we're finally now having a public discourse. That's huge, right? For those of us who can go back a few decades, that's huge. We're actually talking about it publicly. Certainly having a law criminalizing something does not end it, as we know. We are doing a legal and policy analysis as part of the coalition project, which I'm sure there will be a lot of learnings from that about what future advocacy is needed. Okay, next slide. All right, so I want to focus this afternoon on some of the findings from the SOGIECE CD Survivor Support Project, which is 21 to 2022. In January of 2021, I was asked by Wendy Vanderwall Ritter, Executive Director of Generous Space Ministries, a faith-based organization, to lead a community-based research project funded by Women in Gender Equality Canada. The primary goal of this work was to identify supports needed by 2S LGBT people in Canada who have been harmed by SOGIECE or conversion therapy practices, and develop an advocacy plan to facilitate access to the support survivors need to recover. It was initially hosted by Generous Space Ministries with the support of Simon Fraser University, No Conversion Canada, and CBRC. But in June 2021, Generous Space Ministries closed down and the project lost its funding. Thanks to Simon Fraser University, I was able to continue with the project over the summer, and CBRC negotiated with the federal government to have the funding moved to them, and CBRC hired me as project coordinator. So the advantage was that by promoting this survey, focus groups, interviews, from two distinct organizations, one faith-based and then one public LGBTIQ organization, we were able to reach a much broader audience. So it was sad that Generous Space Ministries closed down, but for me, as project coordinator, I was so happy to be able to get out there more into the community and get people's responses. Yeah, that's it. Thanks. The SOGIECE Survivor Support Project was led by survivors, so I consulted with survivors to create the survey, the focus groups, and interviews. And its purpose, as I said, was to identify supports. People could participate in the survey or a focus group or an individual interview, or all three. The three main questions are what have you found helpful in recovering your experience? What barriers and challenges have you experienced in seeking to recover? And what if resources were unlimited, what kinds of support you most wish you could access. We had a total of 270 participants, and we produced a findings report based on qualitative and quantitative survey data and quantitative data from the focus groups and interviews. You can find the full report or an executive report, a webinar, and a blog at stopthepractices.ca in the research section. Next slide. The types of pressures that participants experience. 70% of participants experience pressure to change their sexual orientation, 50% to change their gender expression, and 33% to change their gender identity, which tells us it's not just trans folks or gender diverse folks who are experiencing pressures to change their gender expression. Also, lesbians and gay. Next slide. While understanding the impact of SOGIECE on survivors was a crucial piece of understanding the full picture, it wasn't the primary goal of the project to gather that information. It's been well documented in many other sources. However, our findings did indicate that shame, and that's number one, shame, anxiety, difficulty celebrating 2S LGBTQ identities, depression, and difficulty in romantic or sexual relationships were 5 most prevalent impacts on survivors, with over 70% of participants experiencing this. Another learning was that a number of participants shared that they had not thought of themselves as survivors or hadn't been impacted by conversion practices or SOGIECE until they read about our research or were completing the survey. Participants spoke of the importance of recognizing their experience as trauma, of understanding the deep ways in which their psyche had been harmed. We asked participants what they found most helpful. Next slide. Well, I will just sort of give you the top few. I won't read through them all. Like I say, they're all available in the report. So while the work involved in overcoming the effects of conversion practices is unique for each survivor, there are a number of concepts which survivors have in common. Their recovery was helped by friendships with affirming people. No surprise there. Relationships where they are heard, believed, understood, and supported. Friendships with 2S LGBTQ people and accessing queer-friendly spaces, 84%. Learning how to live authentically, which may include coming out when or if they can do so safely. Having their emotions acknowledged and affirmed as valid. And learning to understand their emotions. Next slide. This slide shows the 10 most common barriers faced during recovery. And again, overcoming shame, number 1. Knowing how much to share and with whom. Overcoming internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. Restoring personal agency and self-worth. Recognizing the harm experienced from SOGIECE or conversion therapy practices. And it goes on down. One of them being deconstructing faith. For participants who experience change efforts in any context, overcoming shame is a barrier that weaves its way from how we are made to feel about ourselves as we struggle to accept ourselves, to often being shamed all over again in dealings with healthcare practitioners who discriminate or refuse service, or being made to feel stupid or ashamed for having gone through religious-based conversion therapy. Indigenous LGBTQ and Two-Spirit participants spoke a bit about their experience of intergenerational shame. They spoke of how governments and religious institutions enforce the cis-normative gender binary system, and how the heteronormative narrative through Canada's welfare system and colonization, including the Indian Act and residential schools, continues to be fostered. Knowing how much to share with them is a challenge that we all have experienced in some way, shape, and that's amplified by survivors of conversion practices and SOGIECE. The majority of participants from religion-based SOGIECE stated that leaving religious communities and homes was their only chance. But leaving brings with it another set of challenges. They are forced out into a world they don't know. They learn not to trust. And they struggle to find safe and affirming spaces, people, homes, schools, employment, and healthcare. As one survivor shared, and I discovered during the focus group, they were Seventh-day Adventists. At the very beginning, I knew the fewest people. I had the least resources, but I was most vulnerable because I had the biggest need. And that is a critical time for survivors, often a time where suicide time. They've been rejected by family, faith communities. They don't feel they belong in the world. They don't know where they belong. They're terrified that they've lost their souls. There's just so much that can go on at that. So critically important that we have supports available at that time. Survivors who experience conversion therapy in the healthcare system, most often trans and gender non-conforming people, but not exclusively, face a barrier equally as traumatic as those from religious communities. One trans participant shared a comment with me I thought was so powerful. You can walk away from religion and still have your physical and mental health needs met. You cannot walk away from the medical or mental health care system and have your physical and mental health care needs met. Why not? The healthcare system follows individuals in medical records, often diagnosing them with a mental illness, rather than providing the treatment that affirms their sexual or gender identity. A year after this project ended, I learned that one of the participants who had experienced exactly this had committed suicide while in a mental health care system where he went to for support. Overcoming internalized homophobia, biphobia, transphobia is one of the most significant barriers. And that was seen in themes of personal awareness and self-expression. Wherever change efforts were experienced, participants spoke of the challenge of deconstructing beliefs and replacing non-affirming messages with like messages. Okay, I know I'm pushing a lot of information up, so stand up. Everybody stand up if you can. Stretch, shake the hand around, touch your toes. Okay. Need to go get another glass of water or something, hydrate, please go ahead and do that. Okay, next one. Yes. We also asked participants what kind of support they most wish they could have access. So these are the 10 most requested supports. Resources to help people understand that small, subtle statements to change are just as harmful as blatant pressures and statements to change, 81% on that. They also ask for affirming therapists experienced in religious trauma, SOGIECE conversion therapy related trauma, gender, sexuality, grief, and shame. Free or subsidized therapy would be good. Greater awareness of SOGIECE and conversion therapy practices in the mental health field. And it goes on. Safe spaces to tell their stories is just so important. And to have faith communities that create that for folks is just critical. 81% of participants asked for resources to help people understand that small subtle statements of change are just as harmful. They identified the need for education and increased awareness regarding how to recognize conversion practices, where it happens, how it's experienced, and the trauma it inflicts. One survey participant closed their survey with these words: "When I've heard the term SOGIECE, I've always assumed this to be formal change efforts in psychotherapy or religious counseling. What I've learned, however, is that SOGIECE can also be subtle and insidious and just as intentional and targeted as formalized methods. While finding and accessing a counselor or therapist who has the training and awareness needed is a critical support, only 12% of participants said they were able to find a therapist with that experience. Next slide. So some final thoughts on supports needed. The data told us that there is an immense lack of supports available to survivors of conversion therapy practices. Supports are needed to help survivors recognize the harm, deal with and overcome barriers, find safe, affirming, supportive people and spaces, recover from the harm and trauma of SOGIECE and conversion practices, and move from surviving to thriving. Participants have also stressed that whatever resources and supports are created need to be done so by, with, and for survivors. And it is essential that supports consider the intersectional identities of survivors. Next slide. Part of that SOGIECE support project was to consult with therapists who have experience working with survivors. Roughly half of the therapists consulted reported that 75 to 100% of their clients were dealing with harm caused overtly or covertly by conversion therapy practices. So someone comes in, they don't come in and say, I'm in conversion therapy. No. They come in presenting different types of mental health needs, anxiety, depression, shame, all the things we talked about impacts, how to come to terms with embracing myself, and my sexual orientation and gender identity. Other therapists consulted reported that while they don't see SOGIECE or conversion therapy clearly manifesting, they often see the impacts of trauma, religious trauma, and institutional trauma. So there's both a conscious and unconscious awareness of SOGIECE. There are scopes of practice within mental health fields. The Code of Ethics for therapists and counselors say you cannot practice outside your scope of practice. However, there are currently no resources that offer the necessary training on how to work with survivors of practices. So this just needs everywhere you turn. Some of the recommendations that came out of the study. Next slide. Yeah, I'm just going to quickly go through the four main ones. The development of funding and a variety of survivor supports needed. Increased education and awareness amongst the general public and specific audiences. Faith communities, one. Education, training, and tools needed within the healthcare system, and continued research. This includes research that addresses the cultural and intersectional realities experienced by survivors and in many systemic inequities that survivors face. As we know, 2S LGBTIQ+ folks are not a monolith. Most research has focused on white cis gay men, and there continues to be underrepresentation of 2S LGBTIQ+ communities, including Black, Indigenous, people of color, immigrants, newcomers, refugees, and those without immigration status. So, next slide. My colleagues and the research department undertook this understanding the experiences amongst BIPOC, immigrant, newcomer, and refugee folks. I don't believe their report is public yet. I have to wait for the Department of Justice to give their approval to the funders report with the public. I'm not quite sure where that stands at the moment. But CBRC's Director of Research, Anna Rada Burma, study, where they conducted 16 qualitative interviews with 2S LGBTQ+ conversion therapy survivors who are BIPOC, immigrant, refugees, or newcomers, to explore the nature and impact of their experiences and the types of supports that they access and wish they had access. Anu spoke about how difficult the support was for her as someone with lived experience of being removed from Canada as a child because of queerness and being sent to India where she was pressured to have heterosexual. That is now against the law in Canada. Next slide. Prior to data collection, the research team conducted community consultations with individuals and groups who engage with the communities that they were focused on. Learning that the term conversion therapy is not commonly used or easily translated. For many migrant 2S LGBTQ+ people, there is a sense of surprise that conversion practices exist in Canada because they left their countries of origin thinking that it doesn't happen here. Resources specific to these communities are limited or non-existent, particularly resources in their language. And international students can only access supports and resources on campus. So international student centers hold the potential to be a great deal of support for students. Participants of the study experienced conversion practices at SOGIECE and outside of Canada, typically in religious, familial, and medical contexts. The impacts of SOGIECE include health, physical health, disconnection, and isolation. Participants talked about the context where their experiences occurred, where they felt a sense of belonging, what supports they access, with many participants only accessing actual supports much later. Relying on self is a crucial resource to survive, while many also found support and healing by supporting others. Participants talked about challenges associated with enforcement of federal law. For example, I don't want my family member to be charged. Next slide. Supports that would be most helpful going forward include trauma-informed approaches, culturally sensitive spaces, faith spaces that affirm to us LGBTQ+ people, and to us LGBTQ+ spaces that welcome people of faith. Two very distinct. Did you get that, Catherine?
I don't know what 2S means.
Sorry?
What does 2S mean?
Two-spirit?
Oh, sorry. Thank you.
Yeah, that's okay. Sorry, I shouldn't find that. Yeah, so spaces that are welcoming of BIPOC, newcomer, immigrant, refugee individuals, and spaces where people can bring their whole selves, feel connected, and have the needs met. Next slide. Recommendations for change were very similar, but some very distinct differences. Shift in language was a big one. The need for resources to be developed in multiple languages for multiple audiences. Awareness amongst immigration services. Expansion of mental health services for refugees, like to eliminate the 3-month waiting period for health insurance and expand trauma-informed services that are culturally and linguistically appropriate, housing supports, legal supports, survivor supports like affirming faith communities, training and resources for healthcare providers, and continued research to focus on survivors whose experiences have not been included. I think the most important takeaway from this study is that if we want to mobilize people around education and support, we need to shift our language in some pretty intentional and creative ways. The term conversion practices or conversion therapy is not quite cutting it for a lot of people. For instance, here in Canada, a few provinces are implementing policies that attempt to suppress or deny identities of trans teenagers within public schools, trans children, or gender diverse. We struggle with what is the line between conversion practices and other systemic attempts to deny our identities. It's all part of an ideology that wants to invalidate our identities, and maybe that's the bigger way that we need to engage people around it. So I'd like to close with a personal word about my experience as a project coordinator and survivor. In January of 2021, when I was asked to be the project coordinator, I was instantly hesitant because I wasn't sure that my experience would be classified as SOGIECE or conversion therapy. I never attended a formalized conversion therapy program or camp run by a religious organization. I'd never experienced healthcare practitioners misdiagnosing me or refusing me access to care. I was doing what many of the participants in our different projects have done, questioning the validity of my experience. In reality, I'd spent 33 years internalizing conversion therapy practices through prayer, study religious texts, association with my body, and suppression denial of my sexual and gender identities. I spent 6 years in counseling and change attempts for conversion practices for youth. I came out as lesbian at 33 and a trans man at 51. I'm 64 and clearly heterosexual, but I spent decades of my life hiding in shame and fear and struggled with suicidal ideation of mid-30s. I have also experienced the subtle and blatant pressures to suppress, deny, and change my sexual orientation, gender identity, and my gender expression on SOGIECE. I am a survivor. Over the last 3 years, as I've heard from those with lived experience of conversion practices or SOGIECE, I found myself identifying with their rage at the systems and the people who silenced us, broke us, and spat us out. In focus groups and interviews, I have been triggered back to my own pain and trauma, having to set it aside in order to listen, hear, and provide safety for those who are speaking. After focus groups or interviews ended, I would often burst into tears in response to the stories I heard. At times, I wanted to crawl away and hide and just be distracted by anything that silenced the emptiness and the wounds still deep inside me that I never acknowledged myself. I realized that in some ways, I'm still more comfortable in shame, silence, and dissociation than any other way of being and living. But I've also been filled with wonderment and amazement at the resiliency and courage of every single survivor like that. Findings from the research that we've been leading at CPRC, particularly the SOGIECE Survivor Support Project, are key in advancing our understanding of survivors' experiences, but more work, including research of survivors from marginalized communities, is needed to build the resources, equitable support systems to respond to SOGIECE's keeper in harm. Survivors have been abused, silenced, oppressed, traumatized by blatant messages and pressures, violent acts and words, and ongoing microaggressions that can leave us feeling hopeless and lost. It is time to build a support system to respond. As someone who knows people who experienced conversion therapy practices going back in the 1970s, it is shocking that supports have not been created for this community long before now. Many of us have healed from the harm and are living joyfully. We are everywhere in the 2S LGBTIQ community and all religions and in Canada's health crisis. But this is not the case for all. Many of us did not survive, choosing to end the pain and shame through suicide. Many of us are still victims in one way or another, still silenced by the shame, still afraid of being seen as we are. Still, many of us are survivors. While it has not been an easy road, many of us are thrivers too. This project and the additional work I've done since then has been a roller coaster of a ride for me personally, revealing some of the ways that SOGIECE and the trauma of conversion therapy and religious trauma still impacts my life. But most of all, it has been a humbling walk, learning from and being challenged and inspired by survivors. Adapting the words of one participant who wrote to me, it is my hope that I have held the story shared with me with sacredness and boldness, worthy of both the losses survivors continue to sustain and the resilience that keeps us